Welcome back to WaffleWars, and in this video we will be going over strategies and tips for WaffleWars. We'll be sharing strategies and tips that explain how to think ahead, respond to your opponent, and make more effective moves. We'll start by going over some tips and strategies. First off, one of the things that makes WaffleWars feel so competitive is even when the game feels like it's about to be over, it usually isn't due to an unexpected move. Because of this, the first tip is to have your mind open to multiple strategies. If you go for a certain strategy, it could obviously work out in your favor, or it could be stopped due to your opponent's moves. And it might not be possible as the game goes on, which is a good time for you to have multiple strategies in mind. Next, the best tip we can give for every turn, even though it seems basic, is to always evaluate if your opponent is close to a win condition, since it's easy to lose track when there's so many different strategies. For example, you might be trying to get a 5 in a row on one side of the board, but if you're watching carefully, your opponent could be locking 3 quadrants, which is a win for them. Building off the previous tip, if you can see your opponent is getting close to locking a quadrant, it's a good idea to place in or next to that quadrant in a spot that would allow you to jump one of their pieces to take away their win condition. It's always a good idea to have a piece of yours in place to take your opponent's win or block a potential strategy later in the game. Waffle Wars involves defense, not just offense, which allows for various playstyles. Various playstyles make each opponent a different experience and also is especially useful in a 2v2. For example, if one of the players likes to make offensive moves while their teammate likes to make defensive moves, this could make for great balanced teamwork, but could also lead to 2 different strategies which could result in losing. In other words, the possibilities are endless, which makes each game feel unique. The last tip is an ambiguous one involving the 4 corners of the board. This tip isn't necessarily a tip, but rather an explanation of the possibilities with the corners of the board. Corners are one of the best places to have a piece on the board since they are the only spots on the board that cannot be jumped. However, if you focus on placing in the corners, your pieces will be spread out, which could make it more difficult for you to work towards a win. Moving on from tips and strategies, now we'll be talking about some common mistakes and misconceptions that not only new players might encounter, but that we also encountered as we have played the game. First off, one of the most common mistakes is accidentally placing in a quadrant locked by your opponent. The only way to avoid this is double checking that a quadrant you plan on placing in isn't locked before you place. However, in the moment it might not cross you or your opponent's mind, so if your opponent happens to accidentally place in a quadrant that you have locked, just remind them of the rules and hand them their piece back to redo their turn. The next common mistake is with diagonal jumps across quadrants. Most diagonal jumps are straightforward and easy to line up. However, some are more difficult and may even seem like they don't line up because they're slightly out of line. So just to clarify, diagonal jumps across quadrants like the ones shown on the screen are correct moves. The next scenario that's not really defined in the rules is uneven teams. For example, a 1v2 game is possible. The team with 1 player would play like normal, while the team with 2 players would alternate turns just like in a 2v2, which obviously includes no table talk. In the same way you could play in uneven teams with more players, including a 2v3, 3v4, and so on. Lastly, and possibly one of the most confusing and commonly mistaken parts of Waffle Wars, is the equity rules. So let's take a quick in-depth look at exactly what they include. The player who places first is not allowed to place in any of the 4 corners on their first turn. If the player who placed first wins, the player who placed second gets an extra move, only if it is a placement that causes there to be a win condition for them. If there's a third player, then the player who placed third also gets the opportunity to make an extra move. Again, only if it is a placement that causes there to be a win condition for them. If either the second or third player creates an equal win condition for themselves, a world war begins. If the win condition they create involves more pieces, they win. If If it involves less pieces, they lose. For the full breakdown of how a world war works, look in your rules booklet in the equity rules explanation or watch the Waffle Wars 101 video for a visual explanation. If you are playing with 3 pieces and this scenario occurs, however, one of the 2 players with an extra move cannot create a win condition, but the other can, then the player that wasn't able to create a win condition is eliminated and doesn't continue placing while the 2 players with win conditions battle it out in a world war to crown a winner. That concludes our beginner strategy guide for Waffle Wars. We explained key tactics, highlighted typical mistakes, and shared actionable tips to build on. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave a comment on this video or any of our other socials. Thank you for watching and have fun playing Waffle Wars.